Hello and welcome to another edition of Green TV. This is going to be one of my favorites because I'm speaking to two people who get it. What do they get? They get the importance of educating the public on climate change. They both have a scientific background, but both have been very active in educating in different formats. I'm talking about Ted McIntyre and Mariah Tinger, and they do a podcast called The Climate Minute. They're based in Massachusetts, but they do cover the greater global climate problem and related environmental challenges. And they've had a podcast that's been going on since 2010. So that's almost as long as I've been doing it. I started in 2004 with my radio shows. And you have something like nearly 800,000 downloads, which is very impressive. Mazel tov. Also about 800,000, let's see, 800,000 downloads and 900 episodes. Is that right? That's a lot.
In that neighborhood, yep.
Welcome to Green TV. I wanted to have you back not only to return the favor, you had me on twice in the last year, and we had a lot of fun talking about how mainstream media just doesn't get it. And we can talk about that today as well, because it's 2022 now, and there's still no programming on any network on a regular basis, other than the occasional, Earth Day or maybe Climate Week in New York week that, is just fleeting. And it's good. It's always well produced because they have a lot of resources, the news networks, but that's it. Then you go away. And yes, they're covering climate change more often than they were, which is saying a lot and not saying very much. What it's saying is it's no longer really climate silence. That's not quite accurate, but it's certainly just the tip of the melting iceberg. And they go to, a Michael Mann or Catherine Hayhoe, and, Michael will talk about we have urgency, but we have agency. And we need to act. And then they go to commercial, or Catherine Hayhoe now is saying the most important thing you can do is talk about it. And she's right. And that's what we're doing here. But of course, it can't end with talking, but we can't solve problems that we don't understand. And too much of America, has an eco-literacy problem or eco-illiteracy problem. So I really applaud you for what you've been doing for a very long time before climate change was popular, if it is yet, before it was, as talked about as it is now. So I'd like to hear just briefly, what prompted you to, were you doing this together the whole time?
That's an interesting story. I don't know if I should let Mariah tell that story, but the podcast began, as I say, around 2010 or so. And it was initially an attempt to address the same questions you raised, that we recognized even 10 years ago that there's a business section of the newspaper, there's a sports section of the newspaper, there's an arts and culture section of the newspaper.
Even comics,
yes. But there was no place that brought together the variety of impacts that climate change has, of course, business and health and politics and lifestyle and all these things. But at the same time, we began with a effort to try and publicize local stories and essentially spread the calendar for the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. This is back 10 years ago. So each podcast would be a discussion of whatever was hot in the news. At the time, my memory was that me and myself and my co-host at the time, Rob Garrity, who was the director of MCAN, we would meet every Friday morning at the Dunkin' Donuts near our homes. And if you're not from Massachusetts or from the eastern part of the United States, Dunkin' Donuts is sort of like making the Hajj. You have to get to a Dunkin' Donuts at least once a day to get your coffee. Anyway, we would meet there, and the podcast was as if the room that we were in was the third character, because there would be people ordering their coffee, the janitor coming by, banging the tables as he collected the garbage, as we would record in the booth. And that was
exactly
fun.
A soundproof environment.
Absolutely not a soundproof environment. As we went on, our friend D.R. Tucker joined, right? And D.R. Tucker is a wonderful guy. I hope that you're able to have him on. I don't think he can be here today, but he is a fountain of good information.
Very smart.
Such a smart guy. And he was for years. And then, I don't know, Mariah, maybe
I can jump
5 or 6, you tell that story.
So I was an enthusiastic listener of the Climate Minute. That was kind of my go-to for sort of getting an update about the news and sort of sparking some interest in maybe a topic I hadn't been thinking about, because there's so many avenues you can explore with climate communication. And then I was at do you remember the conference?
It was an MCAN Toxic Action Group conference,
yes.
right?
Yeah, yep. A couple of years ago, came across Ted, who was a celebrity to me, right? Because I had listened to him so often, and I said, and so we just started talking, and he invited me onto a show, and it was so much fun to talk to him and DR. So the three of us were co-hosts for a bit, and then DR had, I think, a lot going on, and moved to something else, and so Ted and I kind of ran with it for a little while, and it's been a lot of fun. So
it really is fun to talk about it with people who get it, who are also, into broadcasting or whatever the current equivalent to broadcasting is, because there aren't too many of us, right? More now, there are climate podcasts, but there certainly weren't until a couple of years ago.
I remember reading a book. So this idea came from Al Gore, who had many original ideas, but what he was saying was that the media today, the internet, and in particular, I think podcasting, is the equivalent of Benjamin Franklin buying a printing press in 1776, right? It was a very low barrier to entry, right? You didn't have to be a professional. You could publish something, you could use the channels. And I would say that while there are not that many, there is a growing ecosystem of climate-related podcasts that are essentially self-started, and they range from institutions, Yale and these big groups will have a podcast, but then there's people that just started up because they feel a passion. I would say that one of the interesting things is that it's podcasting is a path in that anyone can do. It is not magic, right? So if anyone's listening to this podcast and they got a hankering to explain the news, they can set that up. What I've tried to do on Twitter is every time I see a climate related podcast, I retweet it with a hashtag climate podcast network. So now if you search that term, you find a whole bunch of different interesting podcasts that are sort of pulled together that way. So I would say if you want to start a podcast, start one.
Well, it has democratized content, both in terms of the content creators, because it is open, and it also has, let's see, I mean, it's good that there's a plethora of them now relative to what there was. But, I'll tell you, for someone who's, a professional broadcaster from way back who invested many years thinking, surely when the world wakes up and wants to know what's going on in the green world, they'll be not going to build in a path to my door or something, not what the expression is. But by the time, our society kind of woke up and smelled the carbon, like in the last 5 to 10 years, didn't matter if you had broadcast background, everybody and their mother was doing a podcast. So that's my personal, professional kind of like, oh man. But the good news is there's many more people out there talking about it, which can only be a good thing.
I think it's a vast range of quality too. Well, go ahead, Mariah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think Greta Thunberg sort of called out at the last COP, said, look, media, this is your time to shine on climate change. We need you to be pushing things forward. We need you talking about it. And so I'm working right now on a PhD in climate communication, because to a large degree, the communication about climate is sort of the biggest failure of our pathway to addressing climate change. Greta Thunberg at the COP, the most recent conference of the parties, talked a lot about the importance of communication and said, media, this is your time to shine. This is your time to get the message out there. And I think she is right onto something with one of the biggest failures of the climate crisis has been to communicate about it effectively. So I'm pursuing right now a PhD in climate communication, and we've come a long way. I think there's been, I think, something like a 30% increase in how often, and probably even more than that, I think that's an old statistic, but a vast increase in how often climate change is covered in the media. But it's as you have mentioned, Betsy, it's not nearly enough. And that's where the real problem is we need to be talking about it.
Absolutely. There has been an uptick for sure, and it's welcome. But I think the most recent annual look was 2020, and Media Matters came out and said that climate coverage amounted to something like 0.04% of all the network news coverage, not even 1%, really. Like I had to blink 5 times, and I, like you, noticed this stuff. I knew it was low. I didn't know it was that low. And it's inexcusable, right? And then 2021, it got better, but it was also fighting with the pandemic, which, by the way, there's a connection between COVID and climate and environmental destruction and lack of preservation. So it really is mind-boggling, isn't it?
I guess I have a question, is whether or not, so I think about these things as well, right? You say that the story of the century, of the millennia, is the threatening destruction of the planet through climate change, right? But there are other massively important stories from childhood hunger around the world, right? In the United States, the threat to democracy. The question is whether or not the problem lies with a blind spot that the media has for climate issues, or just the structure of the media that is blind to anything other than a feel-good story. I mean, I don't know if you
If it
saw
bleeds,
that.
please, sometimes all the bad news, but not the bad news that matters most, by the way.
But I mean, the story I saw was of a town where they could not hire the ambulance drivers anymore. So the Eagle Scout from the high school got his CDL license so he could drive the ambulance, right? And that was presented as a feel-good story, inspirational. Look at this, fine young, very noble thing that he did. But the big story was the collapse of the infrastructure that allowed them to end up with no ambulance drivers, right? And so that's not a climate issue. That is the way the media works for clicks, right? You're being sold.
Yeah.
And the question is, if you went back to a day where the news was not paying for itself, right, through advertising, would you get a better, right? So I mean, I say that's a question. Is it blind? Is the media blind to climate, or is it just blind to anything that's confusing and a little bit challenging?
Well, it's clearly not blind to COVID. Look how the coverage shifted on the All News Network. And they went from politics almost all day and all night to, COVID almost all day and all night. And that is not as complex as our ecological web of life unraveling across the globe, but it is complicated. They didn't too much get into the environmental drivers, which is one of my complaints, but they did manage the media together, not just in America, obviously, but across the globe, to get the world to stop almost overnight, change behavior, tune in. Why? Because they made it into an appropriate life and death situation, which climate and oceans acidification and all these other things that are related, climate making everything worse faster, that should be covered like COVID's been covered, and it so has not. And to get to your question, a very good one, Ted, I can kind of answer because I've been obsessed with this issue for so too long. I call it the green bias in news. It's always been difficult to get environmental news on. As someone who worked for CBS Radio most of my career before I had to leave to cover environmental news by hosting, producing, and funding my own environmental radio shows, interviewing solutionaries, that's why I left, because I may have mentioned this when I was on your show a couple of times. My news director back in 1997, when I pitched a show called Trash Talk, Reduce, Reuse, Recycle, he predicted I'd have like 3 weeks worth of material. A decade later, I retired it and made it Eco Talk. It went from a minute to an hour and local to Air America National, and then the World Wide Web after Air America crashed and burned. But their assumptions are so to be challenged, right? And the other thing, when I said I wanted to do environmental news because I couldn't get them on, he said, well, Betsy, we did an environmental, he really said this, it sounds so absurd. We did an environmental story last month. And I said, this is an all news station. I said, but we do traffic and weather every 10 minutes and sports every half an hour. Like, what is it about environmental? So there's absolutely bias, and it continues to this day, okay? Especially in broadcasting. I mean, certainly there's plenty of good online publications now. There are, newspapers that have just really caught up after lagging. The Guardian, Washington Post, New York Times are standouts. And there's, more on radio and podcasting. But as far as the television networks, and the reason I'm kind of obsessed with them is they still have millions of Americans who get their news from their morning shows or their 24/7 cable news, supposed news shows. And that's a big chunk of the mainstream audience still. And I just feel that if you're too niched, then you're going to attract those of us who are already concerned and want to know more, obsessed, if you will. But if you just appear on the 9 o'clock show who was talking about politics, like most of them, you've already got that audience. And okay, I'll listen to what does she have to. When I was on Air America, Rachel Maddow and I had the most popular shows, which that's crazy, right? One of us went on to TV fame and fortune, as I say, because the programmers, the audience loved it, as I knew they would. They said, God, this is so refreshing to hear something we care about. The programmers of the world just have assumptions that it's going to be a bummer and people don't want to listen or watch. Now, some people don't, right? And it can be a bummer. but it can also be the most exciting, compelling subject area if you can, distill our planet's future into a subject or topic, if you make it exciting and if you focus on the solutions that are reality based, not pie in the sky, change a light bulb, and it's just mind boggling to me. And I suppose you too as well, that there still in 2022 is no regular programming on our planetary pickle and what we might choose to do about it if we only knew more or were more motivated.
I often wonder, I think those are all really, like, it's all very true. There needs to be more. There's this sort of chicken and egg thing though, right? I turn on NPR, I listen to NPR regularly. And where I used to very rarely hear a climate story, once a month maybe, now you hear one 3 times a week, right? Which I'm always like, oh, another climate story. It's very exciting.
I know, yeah.
Yeah. And then, so the Yale Center for Climate Communication came out with a report just a month, actually the beginning of this month, that shows that the percentage of people who are alarmed about climate change has increased, that the percentage of people who are concerned has increased. All of those numbers are trending upward. And so is it that now the media is playing more climate news because there's more listeners that are enthusiastic about it, or are more listeners concerned and alarmed because there's more media playing?
Yes,
so I
yes,
wonder.
it's both. It's absolutely got to be both, but that's what's so maddening about the refusal to put this kind of programming on the big channels, for years and years and years that I've been pitching, because that it would reach an audience and then it grows from there. Once the more people who understand what's going on, the more want to watch to find out or listen, what can we do? But by not doing it, and with Fox, which, I talk a lot about, the right-wing media to this day, downplaying climate science or COVID science for that matter, in this vacuum that was mainstream media, television networks, nature abhors a vacuum. Well, nature really abhors this one because the vacuum, is hurting nature, right? So part of it.
What I've noticed is that there is, Katie Tur, who's on MSNBC, she's a mid-afternoon show, and she occasionally, does a story, right, that fits right in. And I think it's the question of the chicken and egg question is a good one. I think they all want clicks. And so there's this sort of feedback loop where if your response to the story is acceptable, you can do another one, and it sort of spirals itself up. And I think that there are people I think people are smarter than you give them credit for. And many of them have heard that climate change is an issue. And when they see California burning, right, there's some little thing that tickles in the back of their head, no matter what the propaganda style of the networks are. I think that there are things. I know here in Boston, there was a weatherman who I did a story on, and he is now in Iowa pitching climate. He includes that every day in his weather report, and there are increasing numbers of weathermen, so these sort of trusted people that can speak. And I think that we'd all agree, or Mariah, you probably know more than I do, but the value of a trusted voice in part of the problem is that no one trusts anybody anymore. So whenever anyone gets on TV, half the population gets to blow them off because, they're from the wrong side of the tracks, politically speaking. Is that right, Mariah? Would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, and I think it's absolutely true that the value of a trusted messenger is essential, right? Doctors talking to their patients about COVID are going to have a lot of impact. And I think the trusted messenger extends for sure to climate. I think you do get a lot of traction from your local media that's talking about it. And that's why it's important to have those local stations talking about that stuff, because people, they do trust those are their trusted messengers, even if they are on a different sort of side of the political coin, so to speak. So I think that's an essential piece of the puzzle is getting those local folks on board.
And meteorologists, speaking about it more, have definitely made an impact, but the networks, I seem obsessed, maybe I am, they stop there. Like, how about a reporter or a correspondent? And they are starting to have climate correspondents, but many of them don't have the scientific background. They just wanted the beat because they realize it's an interesting beat, right?
Well, here in Boston, so the Boston Globe, who I have my problems with for many reasons, because in fact, they just published another scare article about how we're going to run out of natural gas because it's cold outside. But the Globe has instituted recently a bona fide climate desk, right? Where they have a lot of articles, and they have it would appear to be quite capable people chasing down. They're almost political stories, right? And maybe that's what they're focused on here, because here in the Massachusetts, Boston area is a very rich ecosystem of climate action, right? And so it extends, there's political issues, there's commercial issues, there's technical, all kinds of stuff going on. And the Globe has stepped up. And it is strange that, and of course, the New York Times has for a long time now had a bona fide, those things, I still struggle though with the idea that they can have a climate desk, but then the Globe in particular will publish what amounts to a sock puppet of what the utilities want you to say, right? And that we're going to run out of natural gas because it's cold out. I mean, that's the scary headline that gets everyone's attention. How come the Globe's doing both of those at the same time? And Mariah, is that something that did you see those articles? You know what I'm talking about?
I didn't, but I actually had this. It was very traumatic for me. I used to, it wasn't very traumatic. That's hyperbole.
Sort of traumatic.
But I used to listen to the Daily all the time, and that's a great, my sort of everyday news story.
New York
then one day, and
if anyone doesn't know.
Yes, exactly right. It's right, exactly, to the New York Times. And then I was listening, and all of a sudden an ad from Exxon about carbon sequestration popped onto the Daily, and the New York Times has pledged not to accept. I think they said they will not support fossil fuels. And so when they played this ad, I was so upset, and I immediately unsubscribed to the Daily, which, it was a loss for me because I really liked that podcast. It was a good podcast. But I
hope you told them why. That's important.
I did. Yeah, I did. I put a note up and said, I can't support you if you're going to be playing ads for, fossil fuel carbon sequestration. I don't agree with that.
Well, that raises the question for me is, and this is one that I keep coming back to like a dog to a bone. I can't get a good resolution of it, whether or not the money that gets paid to the New York Times by these fossil fuel interests, right? And the money that goes to MSNBC for the American Petroleum Institute ad, does that affect coverage, right? And that everyone in the news desk is going to say, put their hand over their heart and look up at the sky and say, oh no, we would never allow the advertiser to determine our coverage. But it is something you have to think about. And it makes you not trust it so much. I mean,
right. And I'd give anything. I'd give a lot of money, and I've spent a lot of money trying to pitch these networks because I can't take no for an answer, because give me a legitimate reason why you wouldn't want a regular segment or show on this. It's going back years, and I never get a good answer. But the fact that I would love to know, what is it? What is their resistance? And I think after years of being obsessed with this, I think that's part of it. I think that's kind of in the background a bit, like they'll never acknowledge that, but look at, they get a lot of the revenue, but there's electric car companies and solar companies. They may take 5 sponsors to make up for the Exxon ad, but they could do it, where 20 years ago, 15, even 10 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case without greenwashing. But I think what it mostly is that they, I think, are afraid to hire someone like me or one of you who know too much, who could actually start talking honestly about how we need to look at capitalism as a way of life and unchecked growth. And I think that's really what they're afraid of, because they not only are selling stuff, whether it's oil, gas or not, or tchotchkes day and night, but they also pretend that everything's normal. Like I watch the Today Show and it's cheerful and chipper and everything's great. And there might be a story, but there's 90% programming on silly stuff, right? And how can you can't have, it's almost too much media cognitive dissonance if you had both at once. So I suspect it's partly that they just want to keep up the impression, which is dangerous and damning, I would say, that everything's fine, or do a story and then go to commercial and go back to the regularly scheduled programming, which can tend to be light. And this is the news shows. And it's like if they get someone like one of us on to say the sky is falling, and it actually is, that they'll have a hard time just going to a silly commercial or Exxon ad, or coming back and doing steals and deals and extreme makeovers. It's like they can't have both or something.
In the real world, Mariah, we just watched the movie Don't Look Up. Mariah and I were part of this Lollapalooza sort of movie review, very interesting, where we went through. But mean, that's exactly it. So Mariah, tell me, what do you got?
By the way, I
I
listened
mean,
to
yeah,
the first half of that right before we came on and I loved it. And I want to chat about that for a few minutes. Go ahead, Mariah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's this very classic scene in the movie where, and you can see this in the trailer, so there's no spoiler here. But Kate Blanchett's character is talking to Leonardo DiCaprio's the scientist, and I think it's Dr. Dr. Mindy, and as well as Kate DeBlasky, who's played by Jennifer Lawrence. And Jennifer Lawrence is like, okay, this is really serious, and we are all going to die, and we need to do something about it, and kind of runs off the stage. And Dr. Mindy's like, and Kate Blanchett says, basically, the handsome scientist can come back, but the screaming lady cannot. And then they kind of, keep it light, everyone, and keep it fun, right? And so that really reminds me of that sort of this dissonance that you're talking about, Betsy, where it's like, no, we need to make it fun so people tune in, and so that we can talk about the rock star marriage that's happening, or not our lack of marriage, right? So there is definitely that sort of challenge. And I think a lot of something I read a lot about is how do you talk about climate change in a way that keeps people engaged, because fear is not a long-term motivator. So, the doom and gloom sort of David Wallace Wells, uninhabitable earth, we're all going to die, doesn't work any more than the blithe, everything is great.
You do both. You do the problems and solutions. And I did them in my 1 minute trash talk minute. Here's a problem, 20-second soundbite. Here's what you can do. I really think that's the secret. And it can be done if proper time and resources or attention given to that formula, because one or the other won't work on its own. And for media people who say, how can you make it interesting when it's a slow moving problem? Guess what? It ain't so slow moving. The glaciers are melting faster than the news executives are catching on to the fact that this is the most important story of our life. But just got to say a couple of things about don't look up. Kate Blanchett was, I can't believe, I can't say enough good things. Like, she nailed it. Just the looks.
She stole the show.
Also just keep relating to being Kate. Like, I think that's why I didn't get a segment or a show or even climate correspondent, because I'm very candid about it. But that's what we need. You can't solve a problem. First thing they'll tell you in AA, I hear, is, you can't solve a problem till you accept you've got one. And we certainly can't solve problems as complex as, all the ecosystems in decline and threatened without understanding what we're up against. And that's why shows like yours and Green TV can really help people understand what's going on and what we can do about it. I have never accepted the fact that you can't make it interesting. You guys probably haven't either. You wouldn't keep talking about it. What could be more interesting than the future of life on the planet hanging in the balance? And you don't need to make up a plot.
I mean, I think the question of the narrative, I mean, that there's one of the reasons I find the climate stuff so interesting is because you can go off in so many different directions. I mean, the whole question of how to tell a narrative brings to mind the Joseph Campbell Hero with 1,000 Faces, which essentially the structure of the hero going out and learning a lesson and coming back a changed person, which Ulysses did and then Luke Skywalker did, right? It was all the same story. So how do you pose climate change as a mythic growth opportunity for the human race? And if you're going to create a narrative that matters to people, where people can see a protagonist, cheer for see themselves in the protagonist and want to be part of the solution, I think you have to sort of hang the climate story in almost a mythic setting, right? Mythic, not gods and demons and stuff, but I mean, a sort of mythical growth. Does that make any sense, Mariah?
Yeah, I think the other important piece of it is connecting to people's value systems and really localizing what you're talking about. So, one of the things that I'm looking into right now is maple sugaring, and how climate change is starting to shorten the season for maple sap flowing, which means less maple syrup in the world, right? And so, people who make a livelihood off of that, or even people who just love maple syrup on their pancakes, that's a place where they can care, right? Because that's going to that affects their life in a very real way. And I think that's one avenue into talking about these things and creating narratives, is connecting with people's values and what matters most to them.
If you don't love maple syrup, how about coffee or chocolate or wine? Also threatened.
Right. Also threatened. Absolutely.
So it is important to tie it to people's personal experiences, for sure. And there's just no shortage. And climate is not the only environmental challenge connected to most of them, if not all of them, but there's so many angles and there's so many problems and there's so many solutions and there's so many people working on the solutions. We would never run out of material, nor sponsors, I say. So it's such a no-brainer. And I've literally pitched this to the heads of news networks, and I get off on it. My husband says, why, you're going to get a no, or they're going to ignore you. I said, I'm saving their responses for a book someday because there's no legitimate reason not to. And so their silence speaks volumes, and the excuses are pretty lame. And at this point, I'm just speaking openly about it. Why? Because I've given up on them. And they may come around, but too little, too late. And because I now have a platform to talk about.
Yeah, you're doing the right thing now to
well,
speak.
Necessity is the mother of invention. They weren't doing it. Somebody's got to do it, got to do something with this experience. And we say we pick up where the networks leave off.
That's right. What's the phrase about speaking even if your voice is shaking, or right? That phrase about being brave. I mean, you're doing the right thing. It's that's what we all got to do.
But I know I've got chutzpah, but that's because the facts are on our side and there's so much urgency.
And I think that that's sort of one thing that we all need to do is find our talent and our skills and apply that to the climate crisis. Like if there's any one important thing you can do, yes, turning your lights off and driving electric vehicles and eating less, all of those things are nice, but they don't have the same kind of impact as you can by turning your talents and skills to addressing this crisis in ways that are impactful, in such as what you're doing, Betsy.
Thank you. Exactly. It's funny because my first green feature was trash talk, reduce, reuse, recycle. And I tell young people when I get to speak to them in high school or college, think about what you'd want to do, whether it's medicine, law, journalism, and put a green twist on it, twist of lime, if you will. How can you're going to have job security because we're here in terms of sustainability. We need to get here in your lifetime. So just think that way, put on the green glasses. And then to people who are already established in their careers, I say, recycle your career. I went from news, just covering general news as a reporter and anchor, to covering environmental news only. He's
they call the New York Times the gray lady, right? Keeping everyone busy. So you're the green lady that you're passionate.
It can be all consuming. It really can. Any parting thoughts, and what would you like to see people who are watching do?
Thank you for having this avenue and venue to give a voice and a megaphone to folks who have something to say, and to help amplify the importance of communication.
Absolutely. And Ted?
I would say also thank you so much for having us on, and congratulations on doing the right thing. I mean, this is great stuff. And I echo Mariah, who has all my respect in the world, is that everyone should look for their own unique path, the thing they like to do, and there will be a climate connection if you scratch the surface, and that gives you the wherewithal, the motivation, the touchstone to take. And the other thing is make one tiny action, right? You don't have to save the world the first day, just do something. And over the course of time, you'll find out how you can connect your own, whatever your personal thing is, whether it's music, whether it's local politics, whether it's drawing, whatever, you will find a satisfying path. So.
And just like we have learned from the pandemic that we need to take better care of healthcare workers in terms of pay and support, and teachers, environmental whatevers need to be supported too. A tiny fraction of all foundation and philanthropic dollars go to environment. That's been the case from 20 years ago when I first started this. And a fraction of that 2-3% goes to environmental media. So this is a pitch, yes, for all of us. What could possibly go wrong when environmental media doesn't get funded and people like me have to spend their life savings to pay for it? There's production involved, there's travel involved. That's got to change, right? This is critically important. And think of all the money out there that's going towards bad things. So yeah, that's a little pitch. We need some funding, seed money, because guess what? There's sustainable products and service companies out there now that would love to be associated. I'm sure would like to sponsor your show or mine or any others that are out there. And that's what we really need to. Thank you so much, guys. I really want to read your book, Mariah. Say the name of it again and where we can find it.
Oh, it's thank you. It's Protecting the Planet, Environmental Champions from Conservation to Climate Change. And you can find it on Amazon. Under Bud Titlow and Mariah Tinger.
And you interviewed solutionaries basically for your book?
I wanted we wanted the book to have a focus on positive solutions and people who are really getting out there to spread the word and make an impact. And there's so many more people now that I wish were included, of course, right? Hindsight is 2020. But it's a start, and it captured a lot of the great
Good for you.
leaders out
And
there.
the good and bad news, I started doing eco epiphanies, and people I would interview, I'd say, how'd you get started in this? And I was doing like an anthology. All of a sudden, it's like, there are too many people. Like when I started, there were like I had a list of 20. Then all of a sudden it was 200. Then it's like, oh, that's the good and bad news. There goes my book idea, but better to have the solutionaries out there. Ted McIntyre, Maria Tinger, thank you so much for the Climate Minute, the podcast you're doing. It's so important. Thank you for hanging in there. And a special thanks for not only appreciating D.R. Tucker, a wonderful man who I hope to convince to come on when he's not working, but for hanging on this important piece of it, the media and the lack of media coverage and the costs of that. And that's one of the reasons I was so excited to be on your podcast and have you on Green TV, because I don't know any other that really has focused that much on the media's part in all this. It's really media malpractice, dereliction of duty, and it really needs to stop. So thank you for being so smart. And vote.
Thank you.
Okay, see you next time. Thanks, everybody.